I would like to also take this opportunity to thank Asia Society to invite me for my talk. So as President Theodore Roosevelt said famously once, the more you learn about the past, the better you understand, you're prepared for the future. So I would like to add, the more you learn about the history of China, the better you understand China today. So my book is about my family story, the House of Yan, my family story of 3 generations, from my grandparents, my parents, and myself, through 100-year China modern history. My grandfather, Yan Baohang, was born in Liaoning province, in the northeast of China. 1 year after the first Sino-Japanese War, in 1895. He managed to go to school. After his college in Shenyang, he decided to set up schools for children from poor families. In 1927, he got his financial support and went to Edinburgh University for study social conditions of workers. 2 years later, he came back to his hometown because at that time in China, the political situation, in particular in Northeast, became chaotic. And the Japanese start military attack in December 18th, 1931. Few months later, the Japanese took 3 provinces of northeast China, set up a puppet regime of Manchukuo for 14 years. My grandfather became involved very actively in anti-Japanese movement at that time as a leader. He went to Nanjing and joined Chiang Kai-shek, worked for them. And this is a photo of my grandfather's whole family. He has 6 children. My father was the youngest one. And in Nanjing, he met Zhou Enlai, who convinced him to join Communist Party as a secret agent during Second World War. So among the information he got, one of the important one is the timing of Germany attacked Soviet Union, named Operation Barbarossa. And after New China set up in 1949, my grandfather worked under Zhou Enlai's leadership, first of all in Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then in the Chinese Senate. This is my father, his youngest son, Yan Mingfu. At the age of 16, he started to learn Russian and then became Mao Zedong's personal interpreter during 1950s and 1960s. He married my mom in 1950s. In fact, on my mother's side, her father came in 1922 to US to study in MIT, study technology of textile. And then he went back to China, became a capitalist, and bought a factory for textile in Tianjin. My mom is a diplomat, and my father, during all this time, worked with Chinese top leaders. And today, he's only a live witness of this period of the relationship between China and the Soviet Union, from honeymoon to the Cold War. These are photos, my last photos with my grandparents at the beginning of Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution starts, and my grandfather, Yan Baohang, and my father, Yan Mingfu, both were arrested in prison. My grandfather passed away 7 months later, and my father stayed there for 7 years and a half without any charge or no trial. My mother was sent to the re-education camp for 6 years. And then after 1 year and a half, I was in Beijing alone, almost as an orphan. I joined my mother in Henan province, Shenqiu. And this is the photo of the children which parents are all in the same re-education school. And I'm so happy today to have one of my close friends, Yang, here. She is on the photo, and she today is here joining me to share my story. These two photos has 10 years difference. My father, after he released from prison, we took a family reunion photo to witness after 7 years separation. The Cultural Revolution was ended by the arrest of Gan No-fo. Deng Xiaoping started the economic reform and open up China policy. I like to share a story about this photo. So you can see the man on the back of this photo. His name is Jiang Chunfang. He's a very famous scholar in China. Used to be the president of China National Translation House. He was also arrested in the same prison that my father during the Cultural Revolution. And during that time, he think it over. He just wondering why this ignorance of Chinese during the Cultural Revolution. He reminded of the Enlightenment in France in 18th century. And he decided if one day he could get out of prison, he wanted to create a Chinese encyclopedia house. So when he released from prison, he contacted my father and asked my father to help him to set up the first Chinese encyclopedia company. And Deng Xiaoping supported this project. So they arranged a meeting, this photo, with Mr. Frank Gibney, vice chairman of Encyclopedia Britannica in 1979. It was at this meeting for the first time Deng Xiaoping mentioned and discussed whether or not the concept of market economy can be used, can be applied to a socialist country. So my destiny changed with that of China. So I went to school, to university, and did my PhD in Switzerland, Geneva, and then became French lawyer for 20 years before I joined Lazare 9 years ago. So today I look back, I said to myself, what amazing life, what amazing story my life has been. I would like to end my short introduction by words of my father. Once I asked him how he can keep hope and optimism alive. He simply answered to me, compared with the long history of China, all the upheavals and it has been through, my suffering count for nothing. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you. It's nice reprieve from impeachment all day. So I was excited to take a break and come and discuss Lan's beautiful book. And if none of you, I hope all of you have read it, but if you haven't, you have to pick up a copy because I was telling you backstage, I think at the end of the day, it's a story about relationships. And we'll get to the history and what your family experienced and the highs and lows of their lives. But it does come down to relationships. And you dedicate this book to your mom. Talk about your mom for a minute, because we saw the pictures of her as a diplomat. Yeah. There's so much more to her.
Yeah. So, in fact, I didn't know her well until the Cultural Revolution. She was a diplomat. She spoke French, English, and self-taught Italian. And she told me during the 1950s, she was not the best Italian translator, interpreter, but she was the first Mao Zedong's Italian translator. And she worked very hard, for her career. And I think today, I think back, she's really true feminist. And she always told me, Lan, it's really, as a girl, as a woman, as a girl, you should never think because you are a girl, you cannot do something. And so she, in my education, so she always encouraged me even to do the things like boys. But I got to know her only after I joined her in the re-education camp. At the time, only the Sunday we can meet together, and I saw her. Her capacity, her hard work, because she was in this team to make bricks, and she was the only woman. Physically, it's very, very tough. But during the daytime, but during the evening, quite often she was a target of criticism, meeting criticism, and she was even forced to, asked to divorce my father. Because at that time, my mother didn't commit any so-called crime. But her problem is because her husband was anti-revolutionary, and her father-in-law, my grandfather, was anti-revolutionary. So if he divorced my father, she can, get clean, and she can go back to Beijing to work, etc. But she refused. She said she really don't think my father committed any crime, and she want to wait until the conclusion. And I still remember during the Sunday, I met her in her team, and so when she came, she took me on a bike ride in the countryside. And she told me a lot, the Chinese classical poems, Tang Song poems, and the Chinese classical books, a lot of stories. So she, in fact, tried to create a bubble of security for me, and in which I can escape with her the hardness of our life at that time. So I learned a lot from her, especially her resilience. And she always told me in that difficult moment, you have to keep hope for change.
Yeah, she was tough, and you talk about your experience in the camp and so many years there. There was a time where they thought you were going to die. You were so ill, and your mother came and spent the evenings with you. But let's back up, because you begin the book as a small child with your grandmother in your grandparents' home. Your grandfather was part of the intelligentsia in the government, and there was a knock on the door, and the police came and took him away. And that's when your life, as you knew it, changed. Prior to that, you had a very nice life, given that your mom came from the higher echelons of society and her background. You talked a little bit about her parents, and obviously your father and your grandparents. And you actually spent summers, not only with Mao, but also with Deng Xiaoping, who was head of the Communist Party at the time. And your mother, going back to her, was a language teacher to his children, and had such an impact on their lives that, in retrospect, they also saluted her. Talk about your childhood and the first memories that you have being around such important political figures.
Well, it's I didn't realize at the time I had such a, privileged life. It's a normal life, but I was very happy to spend my childhood with my grandparents. Maybe one anecdote to share is my grandfather. Well, what I noticed, he certainly has a privilege to be invited for every National Day at Tiananmen Square for parade, and they always took me with them. And one time, I still remember clearly. So we went to Tiananmen Square. We went on the podium, and I saw my grandfather walk toward a man very simply dressed. And my grandmother told me, "Oh, this is Little Emperor." Wow, I thought, because Little Emperor is, in fact, it's the last emperor in China. Name is Puyi. We named him Little Emperor because he became emperor at the age of 3. And so I saw Puyi came toward me and asked me about my name, age, and also he said, "Oh, Lan, do you want some candy?" Finally, I found in his memoir, he said he always had candy in his pocket because he liked to play with children. And it's to remember, he missed a lot his childhood. He didn't have a happy childhood. But for me, immediately, the Little Emperor recalled me, or my teacher told me at school, the emperor, the landlord, the capitalists were all the bad people. So I cried, I yelled on him. I said, "Oh, I don't want the candy from Little Emperor." So my grandparents were very embarrassed at the time. So, and when I go back to home, they gave me a lesson. They explained to me.
Yes, we realize how tough you were from an early age as a child when you yell at the last emperor, literally, and refuse candy. Before we get to your father, and as you mentioned, he was Mao Zedong's personal Russian translator, I want to ask you a little bit about your grandfather and his background, because he was able to navigate relationships from Chiang Kai-shek to obviously even being friendly with the last emperor and being close with Mao Zedong. He was posthumously awarded by Boris Yeltsin for his contributions as a spy in alerting Joseph Stalin about Germany's plan to invade. There's a rich history there. When did things turn south for your grandfather? Why was there that ultimate knock on your grandparents' door that took him away?
It's a very good question, because it's due to the Cultural Revolution. I just gave you a few words to explain the background. The Mao Zedong during middle of 1960s, he started one of the main reasons he launched the Cultural Revolution was he started to suspect that the top leaders as Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping have ambition to replace him. So he found himself threatened. The Cultural Revolution began as a struggle, power struggle. So he launched this mass movement and asked people to do the revolution against the anti-revolutionary, capitalist, revisionists, at each level of society. So it's in these circumstances. My grandfather was suspected as a member of an anti-revolutionary group in the Northeast, which was very close to Zhou Enlai. And so this was the reason why they arrested him and put him in jail.
And you describe his remaining tough and your grandmother trying to hold a brave face for you, as given that you'd witnessed all of this. And subsequently, we ultimately know his fate, and he was in prison for 7 months before he passed away. Yeah. Your father then was also arrested.
Yeah.
And your father was Mao Zedong's Russian translator. Your uncle was also a Russian expert. Mm-hmm. And I was curious, given my background and obviously the Sino-Russian history and the tensions there, that there was a moment after World War II when China, obviously not only approaching communism, but also embracing what the Soviet Union had gone through and the millions of deaths that they had endured during World War II, where the country actually felt a lot of respect towards Russia. And thus your father and your uncle really became interested in studying Russian. What impact did Russia have on your life?
Yeah, I think for that period it's interesting because, it's very important in China modern history, this period of honeymoon, from honeymoon to Cold War with the Soviet Union. It started, we come back to the relationship between two leaders. Stalin has distrust of Mao Zedong because he considered Mao as nationalist rather than a communist leader. So Mao also has a lot of reserve towards Stalin, although his first trip to Moscow was end of 1949. Immediately after New China set up, he went to Moscow to meet Stalin. Stalin let Mao Zedong a few weeks without meeting him. Mm-hmm. So you can see the relationship between the two, it was very bad. And after Stalin's death in 1953, Khrushchev came to China and asked Mao Zedong and Chinese party support for his leadership. Mao Zedong gave it to him. So thanks to Chinese Communist Party support, Khrushchev started to strengthen the cooperation between China and Soviet Union and provide technical assistance from all aspects, industrial, military, economic one. This is the honeymoon until 1988. I can share a small story in which my father told me that it's about the last visit of Khrushchev in China at the end of, in the August of 1958. It was very hot. So Khrushchev came as a secret visit to China. So he asked a few, he asked a few requests. So he said, okay, I like Chinese party or China to set up a joint fleet with the Soviet Union. And then I like to also to set up a long wave radio jointly. And then the third one is the request was to open a warm water port. It's next to Dalian named Lushungang. Mao Zedong immediately refused because that Mao Zedong considered all these requests were a sort of an interference in China sovereignty. And of course, the discussion, the meeting the atmosphere was very tense. And one of the meetings, Mao Zedong proposed Khrushchev to be in the swimming pool of Zhongnanhai. Zhongnanhai is a Chinese government headquarters. And so Mao Zedong, of course, because the weather is very hot, and so.
But we should just note that Khrushchev did not know how to swim.
Yes.
and Mao knew this when he made the suggestion that they go to a swimming pool. Okay.
And then it's a sort of embarrassing Khrushchev, and so Mao Zedong in the water like a fish in the water, so swim. Everyone knows he's a very good swimmer. Well, Khrushchev. It's he didn't know how to swim, and so he put inflatable tire and struggled in the water. So it's very embarrassing. after this humiliation, Khrushchev left China and stopped China-Soviet Union cooperation and withdraw all the specialists. This is the story.
And to hear,
Well,
and to hear your father's anecdotes and what he must have been surrounded by, and those moments where he had to question, do I really want to translate this, knowing what the reaction was going to be. You also have some funny anecdotes in this book about Mao's trips to Russia and his travel requests, including a personal bed and the eating arrangements there, and how that was received in Russia, and it's quite comical. But what's not comical is your family's experience, as was millions during the Cultural Revolution. And we talked about the highs in your family life, and obviously now let's get to the real lows. And your father was taken away. Your mother was taken away as well. You spent some time with your grandmother in the interim, and ultimately you were taken with your mother to this re-education camp. What did you know about what was going on? You talked about experiencing changes at school, where you were a very good student, a scholar, the teachers loved you, you were a teacher's pet, and all of a sudden one day that all changed. How did the teachers treat you?
Yeah, because at that time it was in Beijing, and after arrest of my grandfather and my father, so one day my teacher came, said, "Lan, come to my office. We need to talk." So she said, so you must confess all the crimes committed by your grandfather and your father. So I was very, very upset. And I didn't know how to answer. And I cried. And so after that meeting, so I got a lot of, in the school, the humiliation, the scorn. So I started to stop to go to school. I pretend to my grandmother to go to school, but I go outside, with a friend, and so we, go outside and to visit something, or just chatting and play, but instead of go to school. And then I, 2 years later, so I joined my mother in the countryside. It's interesting. You say, it's in the Hunan province, it's in the countryside. But in the country, it's interesting today, I think it's really the better life I had in comparison with Beijing atmosphere. Because in Beijing, all the schools during the Cultural Revolution, it's 1966, 67, 68, the schools were closed, and for the revolution. But in the countryside, school remained open. And so we go to the countryside school and we continue to learn. So it's sort of a shelter for me, it's sort of a protection for me at countryside. Because with all my friends, you saw in the photo, we are all the same, from the same background, the same bad family. And so I didn't feel any discrimination at that time.
What happened to your aunt? Can you talk about that and how the shame that her family had to endure as well? Because she was subjected, I believe, did they have to shave her hair? And we referenced how large your family was, but that must have impacted you as well.
Yes, yeah. It's in fact, for me, when Cultural Revolution started, for me, when my grandfather was arrested and my father was arrested, my mother was for almost 10 months as house arrest at her ministry. For me, I always had the image, as a Chinese proverb said, when a tree falls, the monkeys scatter. So the monkeys run away. So this is all the image I had, because all the people in my family, my aunties, 3 aunties, my 2 uncles are disappeared, either sent to the re-education camp or got house arrested or sent to prison. So my aunt, 3rd aunt, in Shanghai, was also sent to the re-education camp. But she managed to get out of the camp and came to Beijing and to meet my grandma. She was alone and got cancer. And so she didn't want to leave Beijing. She said, I have to stay here to wait for for my husband and for Baohang and for my son when they come back. Yeah. And she was very sick. No hospital want to treat her because she came from an anti-revolutionary family background. But my aunt find a friend, and they introduce a doctor, a very famous doctor in Xiehe, in a very famous hospital in Beijing. This doctor is so kind-hearted, and he said, okay, no problem. Just came directly to my office. And he make careful exam to my grandmother and give all the advice and the prescription secretly, because he cannot treat openly or officially in the hospital a person from an anti-revolutionary family.
Yeah, he was a kind man. You talk about him in the book.
He's a very kind man.
And your experience in the camp, I mean, you talked about your Sundays with your mother, and that was really, I mean, a time of bonding, if one could imagine. But you were also gravely ill at some point. Your mother was working almost every day of the week in unbearable hours. Did you have an understanding as to why you were there, what your family was accused of? I know you were surrounded by people who were also in similar situations. But were you in a bubble at that time, or did you get a sense of what was going on in the country?
No, I didn't have any sense at the time what's going on. What for me is all my family, all my world was certainly turned upside down. But I didn't know it was a nightmare. It was a disaster. The millions of family were affected. I still remember I was in the residence of my grandparents, and all day long they have people arrested in the different dormitory, different doors, different apartments, and some people committed suicide. It's terrible, but I didn't understand what happened at my age at that time.
And that's a great credit to your mother and those who were sheltering you. You finally, years later, you were there for 5 years, you come back home.
Yeah.
You're reunited with your father. And you show this picture, and I wish we could show it again, but you can see the toll that this took on your mother in particular.
Yeah, exactly.
You can see how this really aged her.
Exactly.
How was your father and his mental disposition given what he had gone through? And what did they communicate with you now that you were reunited?
Well, my father is very courageous man. And so he said, so let's rebuild China. This is why I tell this story started for Encyclopedia House. And he said, well, I mean, it's a very tough life because he spent in the single cell in prison for 7.5 years. He saw only the investigators and the guard, right? And
he maintained his Russian there too?
Yes, and what he still want to keep his, he said, I shouldn't become, mad. And so every day he tried to memorize all the Russian vocabulary and sing all the Russian songs. And he told me that one day the investigator came and said, oh, Ye Mingfu, you have to confess. You have to say that you committed, not you. You helped Liu Shaoqi, President Liu Shaoqi, to translate state secret, to Soviet Union leaders. My father said, it's really nonsense. It's never happened. They said, if you confess it, you can be released immediately. My father told me, it's really, you need to think about what it will be your life for the rest of life in the prison, or you make a false accusation. But he preferred to be honest and not to make any lie. So I admire greatly him, his courage and his integrity.
And his faith in China. I mean, ultimately the Cultural Revolution came to an end at the expense of millions of lives. There were trials. And your father did not give up on his government. In fact, he went back to work in government under Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah.
What was his life like subsequently?
Yeah, it's interesting because he told me one day that, well, after Cultural Revolution, so Deng Xiaoping invited him to join the government. And in fact, a lot of ministers and the Chinese top leaders were spent either 7, 8 years in the same prison. So after Cultural Revolution, they all came to power. And so my father told me, after Cultural Revolution, he was a minister, in the party, in charge of the different things. And by the end, he think what is the most, for him, important mission and the most interesting and important job he got, it was when he worked at the Ministry of Social Affairs. It's in the middle of 90s. Because he said when he worked with the Chinese leader as a Russian interpreter, he was in Zhongnanhai, far away from the reality of China. And when he was a deputy minister in the Social Affairs Ministry, he realized how big gap in China, especially between the developed area and poor area. He was even astonished to see it is still so many poor people in the remote country. So he devoted for the rest of his life to the NGO to help people in need, and set up this first NGO for China Charity Federation.
Following in his father's footsteps, right?
Yes, exactly.
And he also had a role that he was open with you about during the Tiananmen Square massacre, right? And what was that role, and what was his take on what transpired?
Well, he was, yes, so he was at the Tiananmen Square because at the time he was in the party secretary as one of the party secretary general. I was in Switzerland. I was studying in Geneva, so I was there looking every day on TV. And so he went to Tiananmen Square to talk with students. So I wrote this chapter in my book. And of course, this is a tragic event for China in the modern history. So in any country and society, if such tragic event happens, it will always take time and courage to analyze it, to judge it, and so to fully understand and the reason and the why. So I think it will happen in China.
You give a lot of credit in the book to Deng Xiaoping and the openness of society and reaching out to Western countries on an economic standpoint. And I thought some of the most pivotal points in the book, aside from your family's experiences, were yours in Switzerland. And the fact that, once your family was reunited, you went back to school, went back to being that star student, and had the opportunity to travel abroad. I believe you could have gone to the United States or Switzerland, and you chose Switzerland. And if we can fast forward, because I think we have 10 more minutes of the two of us, and then we'll open up to questions, but if we can fast forward to present time, your experience as a student abroad and meeting different students from various backgrounds, you met Israelis, you had never met Israelis before, it really gave you a sense of what people from different cultures and nationalities were like. And that was crucially vital to who you are today as a global businesswoman. Can you talk about that experience and then translate what that means today when you hear more and more, given the current tensions between the United States and China, that its impact on students in particular, students being able to study here in the United States and vice versa?
Yeah, it's a very good example because I taught in my book my experience. So I went to Geneva to do a PhD in 1984. It's a very early stage of opening of China. And I was with another friend. We were the first Chinese student in this Graduate Institute of International Studies to do a PhD. And I still remember, it's a postgraduate school, so in our class we have only 15 or 16 students, very small class, but one of them came from Israel. For me, in our mind at that time, during the whole Cultural Revolution in China, so the Israel was our worst enemy. So I said, wow, it's someone from enemy country. And then she was brilliant. And so later on, I learned she was also, she used to serve also in the army. So it's, oh la la, it's really very, we have to be very alert with my Chinese friend. We said, we don't like to talk with her. So in fact, this example to show how the brand wash can be.
Right.
In a country, you have only one side story, right? And you didn't know other, aspect of the truth. It's also interesting. So in the same school, we have a Taiwan student. And during the dinner, we discussed about whether or not Kuomintang nationalists fought against Japanese. I said, you never fought, the Kuomintang never fight against Japanese. And he was very angry. He said, I don't think, the communists did. So in fact, in our book material in the school at that time, they didn't tell anything about it. So this shows you how you can influence the people by the one-side story, especially for the students. So the exchange of students, for me, I'm greatly beneficial for this experience in Switzerland and then US. Learned a lot, and I learned to make my own judgment, to make an analysis from all different sources of information.
Yeah.
And this exchange of international students, the Americans go to China, Chinese come here, it's so important. We serve as a bridge between the two countries, between the two cultures. It's the link of the future international development and cooperation.
Yeah, diplomacy, you could really say, starts with students and exchanges. Talking about the current tensions and trade war between the U.S. and China, what concerns you the most about it? I know you're your father's daughter. He's an eternal optimist. Are you optimistic that things will simmer down, or now that we've got the phase one of the deal, we're in an election year here, do you think we've experienced the worst, or do you think there's more sort of decoupling ahead, and does that worry you?
Yeah, after 40 years of strategic cooperation between China and the U.S., I think now we entered into a new phase. It's, I must say, unfortunately, it's a phase of strategic competition and constant confrontation between two countries. This first phase of agreement at least gave a signal of de-escalation, because since 18 months we witnessed the escalation of trade war, tech war, even currency war, etc. So this agreement the merit of this agreement is to reduce the tension on trade between two countries and also reduce certain uncertainty for the global economy for 2020. But it not resolve this decoupling issue. No one, well, I mean, a lot of friends, we don't wish to have a decoupling between China and the US. But indeed, well, this agreement show that we continue to do trade. And in this front, we shouldn't say they're decoupling. But unfortunately, on the technology side, for 5G, AI, etc., so we are seeing the decoupling happen.
Aside from being a global business leader, full disclosure, my husband also works at Lazard, and Lan, in her spare time, works as a booker and diplomat of sorts, because I had the first U.S. interview with the CEO of Huawei last year, and that was in large part because of Lan's connection. So she just disclosed that on the subject of 5G and technology. Just a couple more questions.
Yeah.
One,
but just a footnote. In fact, I introduced Bianna without knowing him.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the story continues to evolve, and it's one of the biggest stories in the world right now. I'm curious, given my background and your family's background, what you make of the new romance, I would call it, between Vladimir Putin and who he calls his best friend, President Xi. Given the tensions in the relationship going back decades, and now China's sort of the behemoth, and Russia's the smaller superpower of the two, I would say, minus nuclear arms. How long do you think that this friendly relationship can last, and what do you make of it?
I think, first of all, I should say, so today China and Russia has the normal diplomatic relation, well, between two countries. Of course, recently it's strengthened this cooperation between China and Russia due to the US trade war and attitude. So all it's game of geopolitical. And so when you close, but I think between China and Russia, we have this relationship, the cooperation by interest.
Yes.
It's not by love.
Right. North Korea. I don't know if anything Vladimir Putin does is out of love. I think a lot of it's interest. But yes, you're right. North Korea, South China Sea, obviously the United States, and the Belt and Road Initiative. From a business perspective, and you just came from China, we're all monitoring the coronavirus, and every day I think we're now at 3,000 that are affected in the Wuhan province there, and many more expected because of the longer incubation period. From a business perspective, how do you see this impacting the economy? Obviously, human toll is most important, but the economy in China, and how the government really there is much more responsive than they were with SARS.
Yeah, that's right. So I have a few observations. First, it's so the government today react much more quicker in the more transparent way than 17 years ago when SARS happened. And secondly, I think it's they have taken a lot of very serious measures to forbidden traveling Chinese abroad, and make whole Wuhan city as a current quarantine area. And even today, I received a message from China World. My office is in the China World building, and they said, if you travel during Spring Festival by airplane or by train, you must stay at home for 14 days without, you cannot come to our building. Right. So it's a lot of fear. I think it's a lot of fear. I think it's also in the emergency, I saw a lot of things they need, for the medical team, the equipment, the treatment, etc. So what is important for me, I do hope so someone can find the vaccination against this Wuhan virus. In fact, the timing count for lives.
Yeah, of course, and maybe in this specific area, it's better to be overly cautious, right, than have this become a pandemic. Because from a television perspective, it's never a good sign when you're starting to book all of the medical experts you can on pandemics, and hopefully this can get under wraps soon. You begin, and I promise this will be the last question before I open up. You begin each chapter with a proverb.
Yes.
Why did you decide to do that, and do you have a favorite one?
Well, I know I like everyone. So, but well, I mean, even in my, among my friends, they call me, "Oh, you're the queen of the proverbs," because I like Chinese proverbs. So quite often I quote Chinese proverbs. So I like, in particular, one my grandmom told me when I was young. It's Mr. Sai lost horse. I don't know if you remember that. You will discover the story in my book. And it's just said, in the misfortune, you can draw always positive strengths.
Yeah. Your mother was a very special woman. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much.
It's a fantastic book, and it gives you a lot of perspective on the history of the Cultural Revolution and what millions of Chinese went through, but also it's a wonderful family and relationship story and a success story on your part. So
thank you
I'm sure your
so
parents
much.
would be proud. Thank you so much, Lan.
you.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Thank you.